24 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in this Monday morning. Let's see, if I had gone to sleep, I guess in the early 70s, and I woke up recently, I'd say, hey, we still don't like Russia, huh?
Yeah.
Right? But
exactly.
We kind of come full circle since when we were kids, right? As far as our relationship with Russia goes. Mm-hmm. The last time we had a discussion on Russia, by the way, we put the podcast up on YouTube, and we had a lot of visitors from Russia looking at us. So
yeah.
If you are Russian, we're not talking about you. We're talking about your leaders. Allan Topol is on the phone. He has written a book called Resurgence. It's a novel, but it really does make you wonder about some of the things you're reading in the news, especially like things like Crimea. I think that's probably fair to say. Allan Topol is an attorney, a journalist, contributor to the New York Times, the Washington Post, Yale Law Journal. He's an avid wine collector and connoisseur. I guess you have to be when you're writing like this, right?
Mm-hmm, I would say.
He's a researcher and a best-selling author. Where were we the other day with all the wine? Oh, that little restaurant we went to.
Yes.
Yeah, they poured big glasses of wine.
Yeah,
too.
huge.
Like soda.
Yeah, it was great.
Allan, good morning, sir. How are you?
Morning, Larry and Robin. It's a pleasure to be back with you. I always love talking with the two of you, so thanks for having me back.
Oh, you're welcome. Where are you?
I'm in Washington, D.C., where I have lived for a long time, and I'm afraid I'm hanging out with all the scoundrels that have come in every administration in this town.
I wonder what it is with the word Russian when we put something up on the internet. This will have it in it, obviously, because of your title. It just generates clicks. Now, it doesn't mean that people necessarily like what we're talking about, but they're curious what we're talking about.
Oh, I think that's right, and that's part of the reason I wrote this book, because, as you said, it's a novel. It's meant to be a thrilling story. I mean, on one level, it's sort of fun. Opens with a 12-year-old boy who loves baseball. He's in Maryland. His grandparents' house is burning to the ground. He escapes and gets to Paris, France. So it's meant to be a page-turner, but the background issue, which is what made me write it, is, and I think your opening comments put it very well, we're sliding back into the Cold War with Russia, and that's kind of what's happening right now.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know that it's our fault. I mean, look at some of the things that's happening. So, I mean, the collusion stories, I don't know that I believe them, but there are other real things that are happening. The Crimea incident is a good one.
Absolutely. Crimea is perfect because, let's face it, here's what we're dealing with is there's no question about Putin by background is a former KGB agent.
Right.
So his whole training, he's used to making trouble, and that's exactly what he's doing. And there is the Crimea incident confirms that what he would like to do is recreate to the extent he can the old Soviet empire, and he's going to expand beyond Russia's borders. And I think that's what we have to deal with, a very expansive Putin.
Right. But as a novelist, do you include world truths like that because it supports the story better, or is it your way of sending a message? Well,
it's both, Larry, because I created a fiction Russian president, my President Kuznetsov in the novel, but he's behaving a lot like Putin's behaving. But I wrote the book 2 years ago. I started to write it because of lead time, and in a certain sense, the realities caught up with the book and merged them together. So I really want the book to be realistic as background, and I want people also to understand the book as a kind of wake-up call.
Yes.
Here's what's happening, but it's true. Yep, and so that's kind of where we are. But go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the fact that the house is in Maryland is not far-fetched. I mean, look at these two spies in England that were poisoned.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, and he's been doing this with all sorts of people around the world. So, I mean, they reach out beyond Moscow. There's no question about it in terms of squashing his political enemies. And so that's the kind of background that it doesn't hopefully take away from a fast-moving story, but it gives it reality, because the fact that he would strike in Maryland is not surprising, because, as you said, he struck in England and he'll strike anywhere else that he thinks he has political opponents.
And when you're referring to the historical background, you created the character of Peter, and he brings forth the memories of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution.
Exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up, Robin, because even though it's a contemporary novel, it weaves in what happened in 1956 in Hungary as background when the Hungarians, we told the Hungarians, revolt against Russia, revolt against Russia. Fine. Then they revolted against Russia, and this was Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles' foreign policy. And we didn't do anything to help them. And the Russians then came in and totally, in a very brutal way, quashed the revolution. And so I rehearse a little of that as background to indicate that that's how the Russians behave, and nothing's really changed at this point in time. So it's an unfortunate event.
Do you know, there was an article in the news. I think I saw it in the New York Times, or it might have been USA Today, or both, and it indicated that the ads. I'm sorry, the Facebook ads, the 3,000 Facebook ads or whatever, were for the bulk of them, they were trying to inflame race-related tensions in this country. So they're trying to pit us against, and you know, I said this for the longest time. I said, you know, the news doesn't look like my life. They keep making it seem like whites and blacks are somehow against each other, and yet I don't see it in the real world. And now I understand it. It was all fake. It was fake, and it was all part of a Russian thing to get us to bite off our own heads, I guess.
Well, they're very smart with using modern technology, and you know, and I think at the end of the Second World War, they conquered the countries in Central Europe, and then they set up their Soviet empire that way. But nowadays, they did, of course, conquer Crimea, and they're fighting with Ukraine, but they're pretty savvy, and I wouldn't. As I predict in the book, they're trying to reach a deal with Eastern European governments like Hungary. And so they may end up trying to make deals with them and turning them against the West. And I think that's what we can look for, and that's kind of what's predicted in my book, The Russian Resurgence.
Well, even though you've got the protagonists working together, they each have an opportunity to go out on their own and do their own sort of reconnaissance and their own meeting set up with their expertise.
You mean with the two heroes of the book,
yes.
Craig and Elizabeth Wright. I love working with those two characters. It's a Russian Resurgence is the sixth time they've been together. They have a romantic interest which goes up and down, but they each have their own, as you said, expertise and kind of skill sets, and I think it makes them work well together. I love both of those two characters, and I love bringing in the 12-year-old boy Nick into the mix.
That's an interesting part of this. Who was his grandfather? What's the significance there?
Okay, the significance there, his grandfather was born in Budapest and grew up in Budapest, and his grandfather suffered extensively when the Russians put down the revolution in 1956. So much so because the grandfather's own father was trying to support the revolution, came to the U.S., leaving behind Nick's grandfather. A Russian moved in, took control, so much so that he branded a hammer and sickle on the grandfather's arm. And so those scars, literal scars from 1956, are still there. And that's what Nick grew up with. And at the beginning of the book, Nick thinks he's very much on his own, but he has this background, and Nick's own parents were murdered a year ago before the novel opens by the Russians as well. Again, as you said, Larry and Robin, them reaching out into Potomac, Maryland from Moscow to achieve what they wanted to do.
Through your profession as an attorney, when you write your briefs and present your case, it's always factual. But to be able to take that kind of experience and turn it into novels where you have that human element is absolutely amazing. You've got a lot of emotion in here.
Well, that's fun, Robin, and so that's what makes novel writing, in a sense, fun, because you create characters and you can sort of get into the minds of your characters. I mean, somebody in doing an interview with me the other day said, well, is Craig Page your alter ego? Is that what you'd like to be like in real world? Some dashing hero that goes off and gets into these national security affairs. Hey, that sounds like a lot more fun than being a writer and a lawyer.
I wondered if Nick wasn't you when you were 12. That's what I wondered.
Well, maybe that was. Hey, but the one thing I like about Craig, you said about wine, because as you know, I put restaurants and wines in my books extensively. This one including, because Craig likes good restaurants. He likes drinking wine, and so I was laughing when you and Robin were talking earlier about the restaurant and the wine, because I throw a lot of that into my books, Russian Resurgence included.
Well, as movie makers probably would love to use that element of this story. Have you been contacted by Hollywood?
Yes, well, we have three of my books actually moving on track to get something made. An early book, A Woman of Valor, the whole Craig Page series is being worked at a major agency in Hollywood to try to get it going as a TV series. So I've got fingers crossed, but things move slowly in Hollywood, as I'm sure you both know. But still in all, it's exciting to be working with those people and see if we can't get the Craig series up.
And you have different locations that you feature in your book, which adds to the mystery and the intrigue.
Well, I do, and that's something that I've really enjoyed putting into my books, because, as you know from this book, it may start in Potomac, Maryland, and we have Washington scenes, but we also have very, very important action and scenes in Paris, in Russia, both Moscow and Grozny, and most importantly in Budapest. And I visited all of those places. Actually, I was in Budapest twice doing research for the book, and they're fascinating locales. And I love writing about these foreign places because it lets the reader then, when he or she picks up the book, it's almost like I want to take them on a trip to these foreign countries. I want them to experience Budapest if they've never been there, and if they've been there, I want them to have memories of when they were there. So I love writing about those foreign locales.
You know, as an interviewee, you're in a position to answer and not to ask questions, but I would love to be in the room with you when you're asking questions. As an attorney, I'm sure you have this very clever way of phrasing things so that the answers you're looking for will be there, whether you expect them or not. At least there'll be an answer. I'm wondering if you use that technique that I took a long way to get to. I wonder if you used that when you were interviewing the people you were talking to support some of the ideas for the book, maybe when you were traveling, for example.
Well, I did, because I was really fortunate. I caught a break in the Budapest research, because it turned out that my best friend in Washington for many, many years, their son lives in Budapest and is married. He's working for an international company, but married to a Hungarian woman. And so I not only spent time with them, and I got to do exactly what you thought, ask them questions about you know, what's going on and get answers. And some of the answers I got were pretty surprising. For example, this woman who's now, I'd say she's about 50 years old, but she was a child. She grew up with the Hungarian uprising in '56. But her parents did, and they were out in the country, and so they weren't involved. And of course, the Russians squelched any knowledge of it from the school system. So I got some pretty strange, but it is fun being able to, as you put it, cross-examine people and elicit information.
And you do have some surprising twists in your book, which we will not give away, but they were things that I did not expect.
Well, it's funny because I won't give it away either,
No.
but I didn't start out with the one you're referring to as a twist when I began. It sort of struck me when I was halfway through the novel. I thought, oh my God, I'm missing a great opportunity here. And then I did put it in the book. But it's funny, I start out with a detailed outline, but as you write through the book, you get ideas and things come to mind, and then you can move it in a different direction. I mean, some writers say, you probably heard writers say, the characters talk to me. Well, that's nonsense. Nobody talks to me. but you do get ideas and different twists as you're working through the book, and your mind's working with it, because you can't stick to an outline like Road. That doesn't work that way.
The followers you have, the readership that you have, is it hard for you as the writer to remember everything, for example, that your main characters do? Craig Page, for example. Do you? I guess the question is, and what this is coming from in a way. I remember Paul McCartney saying that his fans know more about the Beatles than he does. And does that ever happen where your fans remember more about what you wrote than you do?
Well, no, yeah, right, because that's such a good point. It's interesting because for my first, 6 or 7, this is the 14th book, I never repeated a character. And then I started this Craig Page business, which has worked very well. But I have to remember things. And so when I start saying, that, for example, Elizabeth Crowder, when she was in high school, she was on the boys' baseball team. She was a pitcher in New York, and her father was a New York City policeman, and she had 3 brothers who were New York City cops. But when I'm writing about her, I got to remember, where did she pitch? Did she pitch in high school? Did she pitch in college? Because baseball becomes an important part of this book, Russian Resurgence, but it's tough. You got to remember, and occasionally I do get a letter from a fan, or my editor will say, "Hey, wait a minute! In the earlier book, Elizabeth did so and so. You better straighten this out."
That's funny.
And so you do have to remember. But it is fun to work with a character because you get to know that character. But it's also complicated because you have to develop the character, and then it's limits to some extent too. Because I'd love Craig to go off and have some other romantic encounters, but I don't dare do that because readers who like Elizabeth will scream and yell, "What are you doing?"
So he's not going to be James Bond in that regard, anyway.
Well, he can't be once I've locked him in with Elizabeth.
Right.
So anyhow,
tough.
I did that once actually in a book, the Argentine Triangle, and I think we talked about that one. I did have him off having some romantic activities in Argentina. But I had, before that started, their romantic involvement was on the rocks temporarily, so I could get away with it. But I did hear from readers, don't do that again.
In a couple of scenes, you bring up passports. I mean, sometimes in novels, we just take for granted that everybody has papers and nobody checks. But and then when they travel to different countries, but you brought that up. That is really cool that you have all that detail in there.
Well, you kind of need it because that's the area where if you don't get that right, readers will jump up and down, and then you do hear from readers, and they say, "Wait a minute! That couldn't happen. It couldn't be that way." So you have to stick sort of with the reality. And having traveled a fair amount myself in terms of researching the books, I'm familiar with those kind of details. But I think they're terribly important because the reader wants a sense of reality, and he wants to know, he or she want to know what's going on in the real world, and I think that's terribly important.
Let's see. Let me just reintroduce you. Allan J. Topol is on the phone. He's the author of Russian Resurgence. If you're a Craig Page fan, then you're probably going to be happy to hear that I have a copy to give you for free. But I only have one. So if you want this one, you have to kind of be lucky. Call me right now, 622-9622. I'll pick a caller at random, and that person will get the book. 622-WOCA. The rest of us have to go buy it. I did find it on Amazon, where you're getting really good reviews. All your books have good reviews, by the way. So do you have a website dedicated to yourself or to this book?
I have a website dedicated to myself, www.allantopol, ALLANTOPOL.com. And as you say, the books, besides bookstores, it's easy to get them on Amazon, either the electronic or the paper version as well.
Right.
Since a portion of your background has to do with chemistry, are you interested in writing a novel about that type?
Well, no, I've kind of moved away from it, but it becomes helpful in some of the stuff, and it becomes helpful. And also, I'm very fortunate because medical information ends up being in some of my novels, and I have a daughter who's a doctor, so I'll steal her expertise, which she happily gives. Oh, and the best part for this book, I forgot to tell you, I have a grandson who's now 14 years old, and when he was 12, I went back to him and I gave him some of the scenes, and I said, what would you do if you were in this situation? So I did some research with my 12-year-old.
How wonderful.
That is funny.
That's excellent.
You know, I have a real quick question about the poisoning of the two spies in England. I seem to remember there was a comment from Putin saying if he indeed was behind it, they wouldn't be alive. That like the poison wouldn't have just crippled them; it would have killed them. I mean, do you think there's any truth to that? That because Robin mentioned your chemistry background, and I was thinking I could ask that question.
No, I think that he's just reaching at any straw to try to, he disavows everything he does. I mean, no matter what, he just disavows. And I think they blew it that they didn't kill him, and which often happens in attempted assassinations. The killers blow it. That happens frequently. And so they blew it here. Because the same way, when he moves into Crimea and he says, wait a minute, it's not me, it's not the Russians' army, he sends in troops who are in uniforms that aren't marked. That is his typical modus operandi, to deny everything, do it and then deny it, and that's the way he operates.
Well, you've got some really great insight into some real-world events, as well as the talent to tell a wonderfully exciting story. Russian Resurgence, again, is the book. Allan spells his first name Allan. Topol is Topol. The website is allantopol.com. Allan, thank you for being on the show with us today. Always fun to talk to you.
Really great pleasure. Many, many thanks, Larry and Robin. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. We will be right back.